Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to give it just a minute here at the top to allow everyone to join, and then we will go ahead and get started. Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third session of the virtual National Adaptation Forum series, Responding to Climate Amplified Extreme Weather Events. My name is Carrie Schaefer, and I am the project coordinator for the National Adaptation Forum. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we will go ahead and get started with our session. To begin with, I would like to thank our sponsor, the CO2 Foundation, for supporting this series. The CO2 Foundation supports nonprofit organizations and individuals who seek to disrupt the causes and consequences of a rapidly changing climate. I encourage all of our attendees to go visit their website and learn more about the great work that they are doing. For this session and all of the sessions in this series, we're going to be using GoToWebinar. So I want to take a second to orient everyone to the software. So you'll have plenty of time throughout the presentation to ask questions. If you have questions, you can put them in the tab here on the side. We'll have kind of a designated time at the end for Q&A with our panelists, but feel free to ask those questions as they come up. In addition, if you want to go into full screen mode, there is a button in the bottom right-hand corner. Your screen might also look something like this, but the same features are there. So full screen is this button here in the top panel, and then the questions tab is kind of a drop-down panel below. I also wanted to note that this is just one session of a four-part series that is taking place throughout April and now into May. So if you have registered for this event, you are automatically registered to attend the final session in the series, which is going to take place 2 weeks from today on May 17th. All of these sessions are being recorded, so you can find the recording of the first 2 sessions on our website, nationaladaptationforum.org. I encourage you to go and attend our final session that will be talking about adaptations to extreme heat. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to today's panel of speakers and give you kind of a rundown of what we will be discussing. So we are going to start off our session with a presentation from Baja. Baja is the Director of Direct Support and Innovation at the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and will provide us with an overview of the Resilience Hubs program. Next, we are going to hear from Bryn Grunwald from the Rocky Mountain Institute. Bryn is going to discuss the work that RMI has done organizing resilience hubs in Texas following the winter storm Uri. Then we will hear from Missy Stoltz, the Sustainability and Innovations Director for the City of Ann Arbor. Missy is going to discuss the work that she is doing with resilience hubs in the city. And last but not least, we are going to hear from Mark Couder, the Climate and Resilience Adaptation Manager from the City of Austin. So Mark is going to tell us about the city's pilot of 6 resilience hub in the city's Eastern Crescent. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Baja to go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I am going to just go ahead and show my screen here. All right, can you see that okay?
Yes, we can.
All right, so thanks so much, everyone. First, my name is Baja. I am the Director of Direct Support and Innovation with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. And I just want to acknowledge I'm joining you all from the land of the Anishinaabe peoples here in what is present day known as the state of Michigan, but is part of the Great Lakes biome. And I'm very grateful to be a guest on this land, and also just want to acknowledge the flora and fauna that is also surrounding me as part of the species that support me in this space. So I'm going to be presenting a bit on resilience hubs and how they came to be, and also sort of why they are a holistic approach to shifting power to communities, and especially most marginalized communities. First, the main component is just to note that when we're talking about resilience hubs, the word resilience gets defined a lot of different ways. And the word, when we're talking about resilience hubs, is more holistic. The idea is not about bouncing back. It's not about centering a hazard. It's actually thinking about how are we thriving amidst our changing climate conditions and enhancing quality of life. And so part of that is looking at our communities and our systems in this more holistic year-round manner, and thinking about resilience as far as community cohesion, community connectivity, and also solutions that aren't just focused on the hazard themselves, are actually focused on our humans. So I want to note that, because as we're talking about resilience hubs, that's a really critical component to keep in mind. So what are resilience hubs? I'm not going to read this definition to you, but this is essentially the definition that we've been working on from for a while. But resilience hubs are physical locations. They are sites, they are buildings, and that's important to note because they don't actually move. They need to be a space that people can go to, that they can rely on. And they're spaces that people can go to all the time. They are year-round. Resilience is not just in the event of a disruption, but it's actually intended to be there for us to do that community building. So they're a physical location in a neighborhood, and I'm going to say they're prioritized in our most marginalized and disenfranchised communities because they're the spaces that need them the most. And they're intended to be there to coordinate this connection, this communication, to bring people together, but also to have programs, services, and other sort of elements around distributing resources. And I'll get into how this looks in what we call different modes and the different functional areas. But I just want to make it clear they are physical locations in neighborhoods. And the 5 components, I've been working on resilience hubs for a decade now, and have really found that these 5 resilience areas are the main components of a resilience hub. So the first is the services and programs, and it's key that we have services and programs that are serving community members year-round, but also that members of the community in which they're serving are the ones who determine what services and programs are necessary. So there's a few examples on here, things like maker spaces or health services. These can be expanded into lists of 50 different programs and services and then prioritized with community members. The second is communications, and this is where we're thinking about what is the communications from the site just on an everyday. How are we getting information, resources, and other sorts of ways for people to know when an event is taking place? But also, how are we thinking about communications in the event of a disruption, post-disruption? How are we activating the site? So lots of things to think about. The building and landscape is the third. That's really thinking about how are we retrofitting that building to make sure that all these services and programs can happen, and also how are we utilizing the surrounding landscape for that resilience year-round. So you'll see some examples here. Power systems, that's one that most people focus on with resilience hubs, and I just want to also be very clear that resilience hubs are not just resilient power projects. They have that component, and it's really important for us to have power, and you'll hear that from Bryn and the work that was done in Texas. But when we talk about things like the pandemic, having a power system on a resilient hub would not have done anything in the event of needing to support the community for the pandemic. So just noting that that's a really critical piece to know, that yes, it's an element of the resilience hubs, but not the only element. And then lastly is the operations, and making sure that we're really considering who is leading the site, who's functioning with the site, what are the operations of the site, the accessibility, and then what is the task management. Also making sure when I say accessibility, that it's accessible to lots of different people. So we're thinking about disabilities or less able-bodied in those criteria. And this is just kind of illustrative components of everything I just said. So these foundational areas and the core function, some elements of how they're illustrated, and then sort of key considerations. So just wanting to make sure that this is shown in several different ways so you have ideas of what we're talking about in those 5 areas. We also then look at different modes of resilience, and this is what is really critical when talking with folks. Again, we're not just focusing on the disruption or the idea of a hazard. We're focusing on everyday resilience. So this is a blue sky day, or in the case of Michigan right now, a gray sky day, but essentially where we don't have a major disruption present, and so our primary focus is on what are the services and programs, and how are we actually starting to bring in preparedness and the proactive work. So that's really, really critical to think about the different modes. We certainly then have a disruption mode, what's happening during these different disruptions, and how can the site function and support members of that community. And then there's our recovery mode. And a lot of times this involves how are we supporting people with insurance claims, how are we bringing people together. And this can last anywhere from a few days to several years, depending on the type of disruption. The other component to really recognize is that resilience hubs don't go from one day of having a site and then functioning the next day. They really are phased in over time. So when we're working with members of the community and different partners, we're thinking, what are the baseline elements? And I'm going to be really clear that these need to be identified by the members of the neighborhood in which they're serving. This is not for consultants to determine. It's not for local government to determine. This is community members identifying what are the baseline elements that are necessary right now for resilient building, and then what are the next steps or the most optional things, and how are we getting to the most ideal. When I say ideal, we're talking about if somebody wants to give this hub $1 billion, what are the things that are most ideal so we know we're working towards a goal. This is just a visual then of how to go through mapping that out with community members. We do this on whiteboards or big walls or sometimes virtually, but the idea being that we see that sort of everyday disruption recovery function. We have our 5 areas, and then we kind of build out the different components within that. And it just allows us to kind of do this in more depth. And gratefully, Missy and I actually got to do this together. Gosh, it was like 5 years ago, to build out the different components necessary for a resilience hub. So just thinking about structurally, how are you presenting all this complexity? It's sometimes easy to break it down by content area and then go through those different modes. I was asked to talk about where Resilience Hub's located, and the key point to note, and I think I've mentioned this already, is that Resilience Hubs are not meant for every community. They're certainly not meant in the areas where they won't be utilized. And so we're thinking about prioritizing our most disenfranchised and most marginalized communities. And that is going to include communities that have intentionally been redlined, where we have a lot of discrimination in our policies and practices that still exist in government, making sure that we're prioritizing the individuals who have been intentionally ignored. So don't think about resilience hubs as like, we need one in every neighborhood. That's not the case. And it also needs to be considered a prioritization in the neighborhoods that need it the most in these moments, where maybe they don't have the best access to transportation, they maybe don't have best access to health services, or maybe there's just not the best access to support in the event of a type of disruption. This is a picture of Baltimore when I first started working in Baltimore City and started the resilience hubs there. We really needed to look at the neighborhoods that were really being left out and the ones that were not being supported in the event of a disruption and at other times. So just noting that. The other piece I was asked to talk about is, why are they important? And I'm going to say resilience hubs are not the answer for climate change. They're not the answer for what we're doing in enhancing resilience. They're a step, though, in the right direction. They're a step away from the idea of the archaic emergency management, where we put people into locations where they're very cold, they're treating everyone the same, and it's sort of putting people on cots. The idea being that these are in the neighborhood, that the neighborhood members of the neighborhood are actually the ones who are determining what the services and programs are, and they're functioning all the time. So they're really this place for cohesion, for connection, for coming together. And that's really important also for building out what are the needs in the community for the everyday. You'll see this as a makerspace and an opportunity for young people to come in and start to build up different skill sets. There are also locations for senior and youth to come together. There are locations potentially for pre-K care, locations for services that are missing, such as potentially free dental, free healthcare. So just to note, think expansively about resilience hubs because they really aren't hazard focused. They're human focused. And so we really want to change the way that we're thinking about them and, the way that we're thinking about resilience overall. And I want to talk a little bit about what exists so that you know that this work has been going on for a really long time and you're not starting from scratch. First is we provide these progress reports for a lot of our different sites and things that are happening. So you can see the modes along the top and the sort of different resilience hub areas. But what we're doing is identifying what they do have and what they don't have. So when we're talking with funders or we're talking with different federal government agencies, we can identify where the needs are, or with our external partners, such as American Red Cross, to say, do you have resources? Do you have the ability to support here? So this is sort of like the intro of those, and then this is also some of the background or the back of the progress report itself, and thinking about opportunities for funding, opportunities for implementation, and opportunities for capacity building. So different funders can come in and support the sites. So we have this built out for a lot of our members, and when they actually have a physical location and we get started with implementation, these exist. We also have return on investment docs. So thinking about all those different resilience hub areas and saying, okay, what is the return on investment and the savings for when we invest in these? We do this by department in local government. We also do this though by the 5 resilience areas, and we have those return on investment documents. We also have a huge bit of sort of funding and resources available for folks. So looking at this quick reference for Resilience Hub funding and thinking about those 5 areas and where sort of our federal, state, and regional funds can go in, and also our philanthropic funds. But there's also a bigger database that's actually a funding and finance platform that identifies if something's a high amount of effort, what it's conventionally used for, what the funds could be used for, the different grants types, and then the sort of ways that you can access them. So just to know, these are screenshots, but that's actually a usable document. And you can see on the bottom, we have it for Canadian cities, US cities, and then different financial mechanisms. We also do funding and finance snapshots for our communities that we're working with. So this is an example in Boyle Heights, where we show where the funding is coming from and who did what, and how that funding actually supported the site, and then what the narrative was around it. We also have a Resilience Hub community of practice, and this is something where we bring in USDN members and then also partners to support those who are kind of just coming into Resilience Hubs, those who may be further along in sort of the planning and development phase, and then those who are implementing and really asking more complex questions. And that's something we started in the last year. We've been supporting and will continue to support into this year and beyond, bringing people together and making sure our partners are able to come in and really support both USDN members and others who are looking at building resilience hubs. If you haven't seen the video series, this is a really great way to just access what is a resilience hub. You can look up USDN, what is a resilience hub. You could look up Cambridge Community Center Resilience Hub, and then the Boyle Heights Resilience Hub. We're doing a few others this year, but the idea being that we want to support people in understanding what they are, how they function, and if you need to make the case to other departments or other folks you're working with that these videos exist, because sometimes they're more compelling than the webinar or other things that you can look at. I also want to note we have all kinds of documents and all kinds of resources, including operations manuals, CERT level 11 trainings, guidance on growing a Resilience Hub network. So all of these documents exist in our Resilience Hub platform to support folks in being able to move forward. And we're putting that together from folks who are kind of starting in this introductory space or inquiry space, moving all the way through into implementation and evaluation. This is the Resilience Hub website. We make sure it's outside of USDN so you can access it. So that's at resilience-hub.org. A lot of these resources are on there. Some are ones you can inquire about or ask for additional access to, but this gives a lot of background on what resilience hubs are, and if you need any text to be used, it's on that site as well. And then we have our sort of white paper from 5 years ago, the solar and storage framework. Our guidance document is a huge one. If you're actually looking to develop a resilience hub, it gives you this step-by-step, chapter by chapter on how to do it. And then we have our resilience hub analysis tool on there as well. Folks have asked a lot about resilience neighborhoods. Just to know, we are working on what we call a hub and spoke model, so that you have maybe different hubs that are functioning in different ways, and you might hear a little bit about that with Mark. But making sure that we're thinking about different hubs in different areas and how are they connected, and if you have a hub that's really great around communications, what are the ways that others are stepping up in other areas? So that is all from me. Thank you so much. And if you have questions, this is my contact information at the bottom.
Thank you, Baja. I know you need to head out, so you won't be here for our Q&A session, but I did want to ask you one question that came in the chat, because I think you would be good to answer this. So we had a question that came in that asked, with a more holistic approach to these types of hubs, how does this definition of resilience hubs differ from community centers or something like a family resource center?
Yeah, it's a great question. And community centers and family resource centers are really set up just to do the sort of everyday modes. They're actually great locations to consider for resilience hubs, but then they're going to be enhanced and improved in order to have the storage that's necessary for the resources that are needed in a disruption, the extra type of training for the proactive outreach and engagement, the space setup so that they can be moved around for accommodating elements that are needed in a disruption. And then also we want to enhance them with those different systems, the air filtration systems, the power systems, the water capture systems, so that they're functioning for the community year round in the same way around the services and programs, but they're enhanced and improved in all 5 areas so that they're supporting in all of the modes. So it's a great basis to use a site that's already well trusted and a site that already has that community cohesion. And then we add on all those elements from the different resilience hub areas and in thinking of all of those modes.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. We really appreciate it. And with that, I will pass it over to Bryn.
Thank you so much, Carrie, and what a great presentation by Baja. So hello, everyone. My name is Bryn Grenwald. I am an associate at the Rocky Mountain Institute. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit focused on renewable energy and climate change based out of Colorado. Carrie, real fast, can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
All right, fantastic. So we, in 2021, were given a grant to work with communities in Texas following Winter Storm Uri. So we worked with cities across Texas for 10 months to help set up resilient hubs following Winter Storm Uri. This was a really vital thing to be working on in Texas following Winter Storm Uri. The storm left 4.5 million Texans without power and water for over 2 days. There was nearly $300 billion in property damages, and it contributed to the direct deaths of at least 151 people, with the true death toll probably being 4 to 5 times higher, according to the CDC. Some of this was due to people not having power for medical equipment or freezing in their homes. So RMI worked on this based off of the USDN's Resilience Hub Guide that Baja talked about, and we walked cities through the process of establishing a community resilience hub with workshops, guest experts, and materials to support development. So we started with identifying the partners and forming the team as a concept, then assessing vulnerabilities and selecting the service area. Next, we moved on to identifying and evaluating sites to locate your resilience hub in. Then we talked about identifying resilient solutions. So by this, we meant things like energy efficiency to extend the hours of safety in your building, or how long it will be a certain temperature with no power supplied, as well as a renewable power system. We talked about grants to secure funding. So how could you fund the implementation of a resilience hub? This could include the resilient power solutions, the energy efficiency, or just funding for the concept overall. Then we talked about how to develop the site and actually install solutions, and then activating and opening the site. So we discussed a little bit about how while this is still ongoing, the hub can begin operating to begin supporting community needs while resilience upgrades are being pursued. So sometimes it's very important to just start providing this support before the hub is like fully completed. But overall, throughout the process, community outreach and engagement should be a consistent topic. And at each step, we created materials to help support the cities. We created things such as RFPs to help them acquire their renewable power systems. We created guides to help determine siting. So if anyone is interested in those materials or discussions on what we produced as part of the cohort, please reach out to me and I can provide to you what we have. So as part of this process, we learned quite a number of lessons that we think are valuable for people who are considering creating a resilience hub to keep in mind. So we worked directly with the 10 cities in Texas, or with the cities in Texas, but as of October 2022, there were more than 26 community resilience hubs in development across the US in various stages of being either open currently or in progress. This is a map that is linked in our blog that if you look up, the link is down there, provides some details about what we learned, and each little thing on the blog can show you some details about the blog, such as, or some details about the hub, such as what it does and where it's located. So one thing that we learned from working with all of these cities and from talking to these different resilience hubs across the country, that a really important lesson is to secure early buy-in from community decision makers and community partners. So the city and the community should be brought in at the start. This can help determine, first of all, hub siting, where are you going to actually put it, as well as what are the community needs. So some communities might require something really different, like there might be a lot of people who are in wheelchairs and would really need like a ADA compliant hub that they could get to very easily without relying on a car, whereas other ones might really require a power system because they, in a disaster, are not located on a circuit that will be given priority to get power back and will need a place to go charge up their equipment, go charge up their cell phones so they can reach family members, or even to go and have a place where their medical equipment can continue working. We also recommend that communication between the city and the community on their goals along the way. So there's multiple goals that resilience hubs can address, and it's just very important for the city and the community to be communicating about what are these goals at every step of the way. Another lesson is carefully consider where you would like to site the resilience hubs, such as at a city site versus a community site. So placing it at a library, for example, versus a church. Hubs will be very successful if the city's most vulnerable residents feel comfortable using these sites. So a resident might feel more comfortable going to a community center, a library, or a church rather than City Hall, for example, or another city building. But it is really important to consider 24/7 access. And is it going to be an issue if different community members are actually at this site? It's also important to consider, could you partner with a community site? So a food bank or an organization that provides some local good that people would already be familiar with. Another important thing to consider is to start by making the community resilience hub really energy efficient from the start. This can enhance resilience and save lives. So by energy efficiency, there's quite a number of options. This can include really tight building envelopes. So making sure that the building is fully insulated, that there's very few thermal bridges, which allow the transfer of heat from the inside to the outside, as well as cool or green roofs, which would basically just help the building not absorb heat, which might be important if you're in a very hot climate. And all of these things can just help extend the lifespan of the heat in the building and reduce the power consumption that's actually required. More energy efficiency leads to more hours of safety. So if the power does get cut to the building and there's not a backup power system, people will still be able to maintain a comfortable environment. This can also save a lot of money during the blue sky days when there is no disaster, and it can lead to saving a lot of lives during emergency situations. It's also very important to consider partnering with community organizations and local businesses to develop and deploy these community resilience hubs. So community organizations can be really useful for identifying the sites, the goals, the roles and responsibilities of a hub. So a city might be able to go to a organization and say, what is the most important needs for these communities? And the community organization would be able to say like, well, they need access to food, or like they need a good place for children to be able to go, or like during a disaster, they need a very good, reliable place to be able to go get supplies. It can also be a way to effectively engage the community and determine priority needs in crisis situations. So that's a recommendation to consider, as well as getting local businesses involved as well can enhance community support for the hub overall. Our final lesson was adding solar and storage can provide a lot of essential backup power to the hub while meeting a range of resilience, environmental, and health goals. So the obvious benefit of this is it can provide power during outages. The power system can also reduce utility bills and hedge against volatile fuel bills. And it can be really powerful for communities that aren't on critical circuits. So critical circuits tend to be the ones that get priority during an outage and are most likely to be restored. Often these have really vital things such as hospitals on them. So having a hub with safe, reliable power is really important for people who might otherwise not be able to have a location where they can go access electricity. Another important thing to consider as a solar and storage unit at your hub is that this can save fuel for generators, which would benefit first responders. During disasters, there is a lot of need for fuel, especially if you're in a place where people already have a lot of generators. And by not relying on that, that leaves a lot of fuel and options for other people to be able to access that fuel instead. So hospitals or first responders or police units, instead of it going to support the hub as well. And that is the end of my slides.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bryn. We are going to save questions that we have for you to the end and for the whole group. So with that, I am going to pass it over to Missy.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. So delighted to be with you today. Let's just make sure. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Amazing. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Missy, and I'm the Sustainability and Innovations Director for the City of Ann Arbor. And it is always such a pleasure to follow Baja and Bryn in this work. I'm going to kind of parrot a lot of what Baja said. So if you missed it and you need to hear it again, game on. So I'm going to talk to you about the Resilience Hub's work that we're doing here in Ann Arbor and how that nests in broader neighborhood scale resilience efforts. So I'll start by just naming something that I think many of you on the line probably experienced, that resilience in practice, while there's this sort of like pedigree that comes from climate adaptation work, the truth is for most of us in kind of the weeds of doing this work that we don't get the luxury of differentiating between climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and our equity work. This all has to be part of the mix. And you've heard it, I'm making it explicit. You heard it in the examples Bryn talked about it. You heard it in the way that Baja was framing this work, just kind of naming explicitly, this is how I think about resilience, how you work kind of at this intersection, and sometimes certain elements are elevated over another. And that's great and wonderful and true to how this work unfolds for us. So all of our work around resilience is nestled in our climate and equity plan, framework, goals, and actions, which are known as A20 locally. This is our brand, this is the logo, this is the image, and this is what the public sees. So they don't see that we have work on resilience, and they don't see that we have work on renewable energy. They see that we have a shared framework, and that is A20. And A20 sets the goal that community-wide we're going to be carbon neutral in a just and equitable way by the year 2030. And there is a big plan that goes with that. And of course, a key element of that plan is focusing on the resilience and enhancing the resilience of our people and our place. And that's what I'm going to pivot to now. There are other pillars. There are 7 pillars that ground all of our work. Resilience is one of those pillars. And as I mentioned before, everything is inherently interconnected, but I'm happy to talk about how sometimes we lean more into the efficiency work, and sometimes we lean more into circular economy, and sometimes we lean more into renewable energy. And that's all okay. It just kind of depends on what our stakeholders need in that moment and what they're asking us to bring to the conversation. So I want to start by sharing just briefly a little bit about our Resilience Hub's work. So it is not super widely known, but we now have 2 Resilience Hubs. One just finished. We're doing a groundbreaking, not a groundbreaking, but a welcome open house in a few weeks. But this is our first Resilience Hub. This is Northside Community Center. We decided to move forward with this particular site because it is the home for one of our really critical community-based partners, Community Action Network. On one of Bryn's slides, you saw a tall chap in a mask and a little like normal sized chap in a mask. This is here at Northside Community Center. We broke ground in the pandemic. Community Action Network is a CBO that provides critical services to frontline populations throughout the entire county. This is where all of that work happens. It also happens to be in the smaller building in the back. This is a refrigeration unit where food is distributed to frontline residents and folks in need. We also obviously have their headquarters that exist in this facility. There's a school that's behind here, so there's after school activities that take place. This is and surrounding it is a neighborhood. This is a deeply trusted location. And so when we started our work around resilience hubs, we really wanted to center this organization, this neighborhood, and they helped us determine what their needs were. We started with some stormwater features and then power. For us in Ann Arbor, power outages are really common. So we ended up sizing a solar system that would allow for, and battery storage, that would allow for 5 days of power provision without any, if the big grid goes down and it's super, super cloudy. But of course, if you've got solar and storage, you're just replenishing. Sadly, we had to use Northside Community Center as a warming center in February because we had an ice storm that moved through and knocked power out for our residents for 7 days in some areas. Very, very cold, once again, ice, but the ice wasn't snow. And so the solar panels were still producing. Then we were able to actually bring in cots and food services. And so what was a resilience hub got activated in that space that Baja talked about. Our philosophy is to start with community centers and use existing community centers that are providing critical services every single day for our residents, and then help them be able to provide that regardless of a disruption. And it worked in this case. This is also another picture of this, and I just there's a link at the bottom, and I know we're going to share slides. Similarly, we have residents who are like, we love this idea of resilience hubs. What are they? Can you tell me more about that? So we started a video series with the chap on the screen named Dave Conkle, where we're explaining what resilience hubs kind of are for us. It's rough around the edges and it's delightfully local. And so it's not as sophisticated as the beautiful videos that USDN have. But if you want to get a sense, this is something that people, they see their places, they see the people that they know, and they kind of can understand what the resilience hub is meant to do. So Northside Community Center is our first hub. And I'm delighted to share we're working on our next series of hubs. So Bryant Community Center, I'm going to talk about in a second, is actually live, very excitingly. And we're working at Peace Neighborhood Center, which once again is a community center that provides critical services every single day, primarily to BIPOC residents in our community. We need to make sure that they can keep doing that. The pandemic, their demand for services increased astronomically. We provided some emergency support, but we've got to make sure that they can keep doing that work that they do every day. And so that's how we're centering our efforts. And then we're also working with our affordable housing sites, where we have residents who aren't going to be able to transition to other places for a slew of reasons, to turn our affordable housing sites into effectively resilience hubs with community space for the residents that are in those affordable housing sites. So those are some of the things that we're moving forward with. I just want to tell you a little bit about this piece. So I told you that we now have our second resilience hub, and that's in the Bryant neighborhood. And this is really, really important because it's part of this broader initiative that we're moving forward with. Bryant, we've been working there for just over 2 years with the residents. It's 262 households. It's an environmental justice neighborhood. It's adjacent to our capped landfill. It floods, very few trees. In the highway ring, you sort of name it, and it's what we're talking about. 75% of the residents live below the federal poverty level, 50% BIPOC, 50% owner occupied, 50% renter. And so when we launched our climate work, we knew we wanted to center equity and justice in that work, but that's just words if you don't actually work with the community to figure out what that looks like. And so we started working with stakeholders in Bryant, and we said, what does this mean to you? What does this look like to you? And they said, well, we'll tell you, like, we want to go on this journey with you. And they set the vision of becoming America's first carbon neutral existing neighborhood. And we are working towards that with them. They design everything that we do. All of the fundraising, it goes back to the neighborhood. It either hires people in the neighborhood to run the initiatives, or the dollars go into infrastructure investments in the neighborhood. It has to be co-designed. There's just no other option in this work. And that includes naming tensions and uncertainties around things like gentrification and green gentrification. So we've done small things, largely thanks to the support of USDN and other funders. We've been able to work with folks who really focusing on intergenerational wealth accumulation and those who've been locked out of intergenerational wealth accumulation, recognizing many people couldn't afford a will. right? And so helping them write a will, getting a small grant where we bring in legal services, and they're just making sure that that asset that they have, that home, can stay with whoever the next of kin is or whoever they want it to. It's also been planting trees because they didn't have trees. And so we came out and we spent a lot of time working in the areas the residents told us they wanted trees. It's going through stormwater training to make sure that we can install stormwater assets in this neighborhood. So this is done in partnership with Community Action Network. That's the organization I told you at the beginning. That was our first resilience hub. They also run the Bryant Community Center. And this is 2 homes in the neighborhood that have been combined to be a community center. And this has now been transitioned into a resilience hub, growing, will continue to grow in service provision. But this provides critical after school services for youth in the neighborhood. This is the largest food distribution site we have in the county. So really critical services are here. And then we're stacking things on as residents ask for it. We now have a bike repair. We're working on, it's obviously got solar and storage, stormwater features on site, obviously food distribution, medical supplies. We've got a commercial kitchen that we can use. So we've got a lot of those things. And then there's smaller things, like there's interest in EV charging. And so we're going to install an EV charger for the community as opposed to having people incur that expense. But everything is driven by the residents in terms of what this looks like. So these are just some of the things that we put in play in the Bryant neighborhood. And the goal is, as I mentioned before, to create America's first carbon neutral neighborhood, existing neighborhood, right? Like existing assets and infrastructure. And because this neighborhood is rich and beautiful and also happens to be low income, many of the opportunities afforded to some of us on this line do not exist in Bryant. And so if we can correct for those and provide an opportunity for this neighborhood to really be centered in the narrative, we are going to help the entire city of Ann Arbor do this work. It's one of my most favorite projects that I work on. I'm delighted to share last week with the support of residents, we won a federal grant to design a district geothermal system for the 262 households, the community center, the public school that's in the neighborhood, our public works facility, and county mental health building. And if we're successful in designing that system, it will cover at least 75% of the heating and cooling load for the residents in this neighborhood. That is a game changer. In a market like Ann Arbor's where electric rates are really high, we've got to do everything we can to kind of counter the forces that aren't working for us. So just sharing, for us, this is what resilience looks like. It is on the ground, it is organic, it is many, many different things. It is cheeky, it is bringing an ice cream truck out, it is showing up constantly, it is talking to one person or 50 people, and that's what we're working on in Ann Arbor. So with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Mark.
Great, thank you so much, Missy. I am going to share your slides, Mark. Let's see, it looks like my PowerPoint is doing the same funky thing as before. There it goes. Let me get it back over. All right, and let me get it into presentation mode. Let's see. All right, hopefully you can see that.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you for the invitation. I would not be here talking about this if it was not for Baja and Priya. They've been so sort of key in making this happen, but also, you know, we need people like Missy who can provide us the inspiration for what to do in our own neighborhood. As a background, I'm with the Office of Sustainability, currently on loan to the Office of Resilience for the city of Austin, Texas. We have been talking about resilience hubs for at least 5 years. During the pandemic, it sort of faded because people weren't really coming together physically. But then in February 2021, it is hard to explain how pivotal this event was. We don't have salt trucks, we don't have plows. The whole grid, which is the state of Texas, which is not interconnected to other grids, was wobbling, and then 50% of our community members were without power. A quarter were probably without water for at least a week in some cases. It was severely impactful, and this changed the conversation for council, but also changed the conversation for community members. All of a sudden, they were pointing fingers and they were asking us, why wasn't the city there? Why wasn't the city helping? Where should they go? And it was really transformative. Next slide. What it really sort of made clear is that community members in Austin with the least amount of resources are the first hit and worst hit. This is a picture of people in line to get into an HEB, which is our local grocery store. to get food, to get water, to get warm. There were long lines. People just were in their houses without insulation, freezing in their houses. They couldn't go to places. Most of the people in Austin have their water heaters on the outside of the building, so pipes were bursting. But this really sort of made clear that we need to change how we talk about just resilience, about emergency management, about allocating resources to the community members who are most needed. And most of this happens in places in East Austin. Next slide. So in reaction to the Winter Storm Uri, Council passed a resolution first telling staff to work on resilience hubs, create these resilience hubs in the community based on equity, based on sort of access. And we jumped on it and got together with some people and started to really work on it based on all the things that Baja has worked on in her great work. And it quickly got into the situation where there's a lot of complexity around this discussion. There is so much pressure to focus on emergency hubs. People are so much sort of thinking about the winter storm, thinking about the recent ice storms, heat waves. We have flash floods in Austin. And there's this pressure to think to emergency hub. But what we've noticed is that city staff and leadership think about resilience hubs from an emergency perspective. When we talk to the community, particularly low-income communities and communities of color, they're focused more on the shocks. The stressors, the daily pressures on their living, on their ability to sleep at night, on the ability to have the kids go to school, on the ability to get food. So there's always this sort of balance between are we talking about emergency hubs or community hubs? And in the end, it's both. But I want to push on the community hubs to make sure that the emergency hubs aren't as big of an issue. The second thing is, we have focused purely on equity, focused on allocating resources based on need. And council's on board and they're like, hey, we really understand this equity discussion. But at the same time, they say, but when do I get a resilience hub in my neighborhoods? And even if they live in a more affluent neighborhood. So there's also this balance of they want resilience hubs everywhere versus we really need to put resilience hubs where they're needed. And the last piece is this urgency versus agency. We had this storm in 2021. 3 months ago, we had an ice storm, which also took out power, which activated our emergency operations. There's always a sense of urgency, like the next event's going to happen in a couple of months. We need to have these things set up. But at the same time, we need to build trust. We need to build capacity within the community to be those agencies, be those community members who help each other through this process. And that takes time. So there's always this balance of what can we do right now versus what can we put in place so that they're in place for the next couple of years. Next slide. Well, the first lesson is you don't do it alone. I updated this morning. I was like, oh my God, this is a lot of people. But this started with a group of 20. We worked with our Office of Equity, worked with the community groups to identify local organizations that need to be part of this conversation. Last year it was 20, now we have close to 50. We meet with the Community Advisory Board around resilience hubs once a month, and they are very, very motivated and really want to be part of it. So we actually include these community members in our work on a weekly basis for a couple of reasons. One is we want to center equity in our process. Two is we want to provide a certain amount of transparency. When we make decisions, is the community sort of part of that decision-making process? And lastly, we want to make sure we're thinking about unintended consequences. As a city, we tend to make decisions with the data we have, not with the community voices. We tend to make decisions that impact the community negatively. So we meet with these folks regularly. They're part of our conversation. They need to be there to be helping us. This is a combination of community activists, environmental justice folks, but also churches. We have hospitals. We have academics. We have emergency management folks. Everybody's in the room at the same time talking about these things. Next slide. So while we meet with this community advisory committee on a monthly basis, we do have an internal structure to push the resilience hubs forward. And this is broken up into 3 buckets. The one on the left is community involvement. This is probably the most important. This is how do we engage the community in and around these neighborhoods so that we are thinking about culturally appropriate foods, culturally appropriate material, languages, best way to engage people, figuring out what they actually need at these locations year round. So that is a huge part of what we do is community engagement. The one in the middle, the hub activation, that's emergency management across multiple groups, helping us think about like what are the tools we need, what are training we need within our office, within our agencies, like what do we need in place so that when an event happens, we're prepared. On the right-hand side is facility upgrades. This is like solar, battery backup, other forms of generation, water backups, which is tricky, communication backup, like what are the physical things we need at the locations. We meet with these folks, each individual group, once every other week to work on topics. And then on the other weeks, we meet as a group to sort of talk about what's going on. This feeds up to the leadership team and then feeds up to the community advisory committee. So there's a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions. The good news is that a lot of people want to talk about this. So they're always energized and excited to talk. So next slide. But as Baj just mentioned, location is key, but locations are also difficult. We couldn't go out and say, we've picked 6 locations internally, and this is where the resilience hubs are going to be. We had to have a transparent community process to do this. So with the Community Advisory Committee, we worked with them to have workshops around locating these areas, using climate hazards, working with professors who had social vulnerability index and making sure that the criteria for determining who's vulnerable was daylighted and the community could provide inputs. And then we worked with the community about like, where are these areas we want to look at? You'll notice that the bubbles are fuzzy because the minute you set a boundary, people are like, what about the people who live on the other side? So it was a lot of back and forth, but picking these locations took time, but it was really, really important because it had to be right. We have to be thinking about those community members who we don't typically talk to. So through this process, we identified those areas, we went to those communities and asked a series of questions through meetings, through surveys, through outreach, and we finally selected the 6 sites. Next slide. So through that community engagement, we essentially started with 2 basic questions. The first one is, what are trusted locations in your neighborhood? And those were like churches, schools, rec centers, community centers, community nonprofits, etc. But then we asked the question of where would you go to if you had to leave your house, either because of loss of power from heat or winter cold or some other event. And then the conversation shifted to their family, their friend's house. They wouldn't go to schools because of security reasons. They would go to rec centers and potentially go to churches. So through this process, we were able to select 6 rec centers and about 20 churches to work with to build out as these resilience hubs. The hub and spoke model, Baj, I mentioned before. In Texas, we love hub and spokes and broken spokes, anything that, gets back to the parts of Texas. But one thing we realized in this process is that a lot of these locations can't be everything, right? Rec centers are great, but their parking lots are small and can't do food distribution or just tree pickups. Schools are great for some things, but they can't be used during the week. So not every single site is perfect for everything. So it has to be a network of sites. These things have to work together. We oftentimes have rec centers next to health centers, next to libraries. If we're not making those connected to schools or churches, then the whole thing sort of falls apart. So we have to bring everybody together, making sure that people understand what the communication is and what to do during an event. But then also, like during a day-to-day, how does a health center interact with the library, interact with a church to make those things more robust and sort of leverage each other? We realized through this effort that during an emergency, your first responder is not going to be a police officer, it's not going to be a fire department, it's not going to be EMS, it's going to be your neighbors. So how do we start to create a navigator program or ambassador program that during day-to-day, we understand what's going on in the community. Then during an event, we can ask those ambassadors, who's a wheelchair that needs help, who needs access, who needs certain things. So we do have 6 sites. We have not made them public because we've realized that rec center staff are under a lot of pressure and they are constantly asked to be overnight shelters. And rec center staff did not sign up to be emergency management staff. If we announce that these are now resilience hubs and they don't know about it and not on board, then there's a potential for a lot of conflict there. So we're in the process now of buying food, having lunch with staff, asking them questions, and then seeing what we're missing and getting feedback from them. Wonderful conversations. And now we're at the point that we're probably going to start to build that relationship over the space. Last slide. So with that, we are pushing forward with solar battery backup. We are pushing forward with fitting these sites with things that community needs. It's been interesting that when we talk to the community, things they really want a community member, these locations are cat food, dog food, water, a little bit of snacks, and then sort of people there to help them. What they want more than anything else is somebody there that know familiar places, spaces, familiar faces. So making sure the community can be there for each other during an event. We have, through this process, identified about 20 churches that we're reaching out to now, seeing how they connect. Churches are a little bit strange. There's a lot of mistrust between different groups, and not sort of confrontational, but more that like, hey, if the Catholic Latino church gets items, that's not for everybody else. So make sure we're breaking down barriers there. Also focus on building community capacity. How can we create a navigator program or ambassador program by paying people a weekly stipend to listen to communities, be that block captain, and then during the event sort of connect. The last piece is we often get asked like, so when is it going to be open? And just to sort of be clear, for us, Resilience Hubs aren't a product. They're not like, ta-da, now it's a Resilience Hub, yesterday it wasn't. These are living, breathing spaces with people. And it's about building relationships. In a lot of ways, these 6 sites and many other sites already act like Resilience Hubs because people come together and help each other. It's about elevating what's happening in your community. My last point is, with emergencies and these pictures about equity, there's often a focus on the negative, right? Deficit-based thinking. It is so important to go to the community and seeing what's working, what is fabulous about the community, and uplifting that, and sort of showing that we'll show up and help each other when the time comes. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Mark. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, and I will invite the rest of our panelists to come on screen so we can go ahead and get started with our Q&A. Okay, it looks like we are all here, and as a reminder to our attendees, if you have questions, feel free to share them in the questions panel, and we will hopefully be able to get to a good amount of them. So I'm going to start off with a big one. We had a question that kind of related to the first session in this series. And so the very first session of this series was titled "Stop Asking Us to Be Resilient." And a large kind of takeaway from this session was the fact that communities are kind of often forced to be resilient as a result of larger social and economic factors that are leading to inequities. And so I kind of wanted to see how you all are thinking about, these larger structural issues. Certainly that's difficult for, one person or a team to do. But, how are you all thinking about these things? How can resilience hubs address some of these structural issues so we're actually kind of building capacity within communities and reducing these inequities long term? And no specific order, I'll invite whoever wants to address that first to go ahead and jump in.
I might go because I have to leave in 2 minutes to facilitate another meeting. But what I would say is that resilience hubs are intended to shift power away from the current structures and systems we have into the hands of community members and community-based organizations. They're essentially saying, we're not asking you to be resilient, you determine how to be resilient, and here's a center in which we can funnel resources, capacity, support, and other things that government can control and do, and partners like RMI, but through a space in which you are the decision makers, you are the power holders, and you are the ones who are determining how things are done. So it's a critical piece, I think, when talking and thinking about resilience hubs. We're all coming at them from, you know, different capacities and different ideas, but the main point is the intention is to shift power and to have communities be self-determining, to be able to identify what are the current everyday needs, what are these kind of next steps, and what do they want moving forward. And then they get to say, hey, government, hey, you know, RMI, hey, others, this is what we need for you. Can you support us in that? Rather than the other way around. So huge key.
I'd also jump in and say from kind of a historical perspective, resilience has been viewed as bouncing back, right? It's very rubber bandy, and that's just broken. I mean, if that's the true definition of resilience, then I would argue the most resilient system I know of is poverty, because it's real hard to break out of poverty. And so we have to fundamentally shift what we mean by resilience. We define it locally as thriving, like how you, or alternatively, like bouncing forward, regardless of technology changes, economic changes, social changes, climate changes, like creating the system that allows you just to constantly thrive. And so when you flip the script about what that is, and you center different folks in how we get there, I think the conversation changes, and you need to acknowledge a historical legacy that in fact our frontline populations are the most resilient folks that we probably have in the system, because they've had to be.
You'll notice that in my presentation,
I appreciate you.
Raja, can see you. You'll notice in my presentation, I never say resilience hub. It's never written down in the presentation. It's because within politicians and staff, they love the term resilience hubs. It sounds new, exciting, it's innovative, it's like something they can all get behind. But when we talk to the community, particularly communities that don't speak English, they don't like the word resilience. It doesn't resonate, or they think of it as a negative. Like their perspective is they already lived through these floods, through these winter storms, they already are resilient. Then it's assumed that they'll be resilient next time and we won't invest in those communities. So they almost see it as a negative. So to that end, like, I don't really care what you call it. As long as these spaces are there for the community can thrive, the community can sort of work together. Call it a community hub if you want. We'll still call it a resilience hub, but at the end of the day, it's about making the community better.
Yeah, I'll concur with Mark there. I think that the value of a community resilience hub is the first word in it, which is the community. It's a space to build your network, build your community. When something happens, you know where to go, and you know who you can ask for support in some capacity, which I think often feels very rare in the system and the society we have, which is why I love it when these buildings are often using spaces where people already feel very comfortable and safe. Like when there's a disaster, one of the first places where people feel like they can probably go is, like, for example, a library or their local church or the local food bank, and just kind of recognizing the value that these spaces have and the importance of building that community, because there's not really much value in being able to stand on your own. If you have one reed undergoing the torrent of a floodwater, it'll break, but if you have a bunch of reeds in the water, they can all stand together.
Great, thank you. So the next question is very kind of practical, but I'm sure many of our attendees are wondering this. We had someone ask, could panelists share some examples of specific grant and funding opportunities they have successfully applied for and what those funds help to support?
I will say RMI actually tracks some of this stuff. We have a tool called FOLD, FFOLW, which I think stands for federal funding opportunities for local decarbonization. So please look up that tool. You can filter it for these kinds of results. We also have a specific funding and financing team. My coworker, Matthew Popkin, leads it. If there's interest in leading to that, I don't personally know much about the funding, but we did make some funding roadmaps that we distributed to the various cities. So we have resources available to distribute if that's something that people are interested in seeing.
For Ann Arbor, we were able to get, for our very first resilience hub, we had a funder from a solar moonshot that wanted just to give like $25,000 throughout the country to every state, like some community. And so one, I would say, tell your story a lot, because they found us because we were like, we want to do this, we want to do this, we want to do this. And they're like, so do we. And that wasn't enough money for doing what we wanted to do. So we went back to the funder and said, what if we match it, will you give more? And they ended up saying yes. And so that's how like we started our work in that space. And then I'm not going to tell you how we fund the rest because it's not fair. No, I'm just kidding. We, in November, Ann Arborites became the 8th community in America to tax themselves to fund climate work. So starting July 1, we will have 20 years of recurring revenue dedicated just to climate action.
We fund our projects through, one is ARPA funding, American Rescue Planning Act, some of it was allocated to resilience hubs. We are busy now trying to apply for IRA money, American Inflation Reduction Act. And there's a lot of federal funding coming down. But beyond that, a lot of this is like little tiny small projects that we're trying to find local funding for, either through departments or through agencies or through other local groups. Once you break it down to little pieces, it becomes a lot easier to manage.
And we just had another question come in that relates to this. And Missy, I guess this doesn't apply to you as much because you now have some consistency in this funding, but maybe Mark, you can speak to this. Do you feel kind of confident in the consistency of this funding or your ability to find this funding so these services and the hubs can kind of be counted on over time?
There's definitely a tension there, right? Because we have deferred maintenance at these locations. I mean, some of these locations have broken windows. They need updates to their roofs. Meanwhile, council's like, we want solar panels on them. And there's sort of this balance between like, what can we sort of get right now because it's hot versus like, what do we need to balance over the long term? And that's a big struggle for our Parks and Rec. The other issue is that Parks and Rec get thrown everything from like, hey, you're not doing like historic preservation and community like childcare and senior center. Oh, and now you're also emergency hubs and shelters. Like they're like, stop, just we don't want any more stuff. So it's been a lot of like trust building and working through like what can we actually pay right now, what can we sort of spread out over the long term, and being a little bit craftier with the funding, because I don't see this as a sustained funding source forever. But meanwhile, these events are happening more often and they're more severe, so there's a mismatch. And the last piece is there's a huge political upheaval around this work. Like our city manager got fired a month ago, and like politicians are switching out because these events are happening so often, and we're not prepared for them. Is that people are getting mad.
I just want to offer that it's still true for Ann Arbor. While we have a portion of revenue that's been dedicated that we did not have when we started, we don't have the volume of revenue that's necessary to make the kinds of investments that we're talking about. And so one of the things I think a lot about with our community partners is, to Mark's point, there are recurring needs that they have. And if we're able, for example, because solar is really alluring right now for folks, can we do some energy efficiency work and some renewable energy deployments, which means their operating costs are lower, which means those dollars can be put into more services or handle that deferred maintenance. And so really working with our stakeholders to understand what their needs are in those pieces of infrastructure so that we can leverage whatever funding we can squeak out and make sure it goes as far and purposeful as it's used, it can go as far as it can and is as purposeful and aligned with the mission and needs of that organization. That's sort of how we think about the dollars that are available.
So the next question I want to dive into is kind of about forming partnerships and engagement. So someone asked, I was wondering how you approach external partners to get involved, and then how do you keep them engaged moving forward, since these projects can be ongoing and involve a lot of different people and groups.
Who wants to go first? Oh, I mean, so there's a couple of things. One is because it's such a hot topic right now, everybody wants to be involved. That's great to have that energy and like sort of tap into that and say, we need to do a lot of work. Here's work that you can do. Here's work we can do together, and sort of, connect on that piece. And because these events are happening so often, there seems to be a lot of energy around this and people want to help. The other thing is being clear and being really specific. Like, I need help for this, Because what you don't want to do is, string people along, don't ask them any questions, don't get them involved, and just have meetings for the sake of meetings. Like every meeting, I have to have a situation where I'm asking them questions. I need their advice. I need them to help. And then meanwhile, they're like, I want to help more. So I put them on work groups. And it's just about like being intentional and being honest and being clear. Like sometimes I fail. Sometimes we don't need to meet. Here's an email. Like just, being respectful is key. And then once they see that you're trying and that they understand where you're going, they have a tendency to help you out.
I agree. And I would say for our work, it's not about a resilience hub. It's actually about the relationship, and the resilience hub is but a piece of it. And so we're working with multiple organizations in a multitude of ways. Like we're going to throw a neighborhood block party with one of them, and another, they're actually helping hire a staff member in our office because we want to make sure that they work collaboratively in that space. And so the resilience hub is not the end, but just a part of the process and the institutional kind of muscles that we're building and flexing together.
I will say, as part of our review of resilience hubs across the country, we did see that the ones that partner with outside organizations, especially on determining community needs, tend to do fairly well. This can also be because people who would benefit the most from a hub can sometimes feel like they can't rely on the local government. So having that intermediary makes them feel like they can trust it a little bit more, or there's like a good translator so their concerns will be heard. This is especially important if you're dealing with communities that might not speak English or have a history of marginalization. So for example, if you're in an area with a high Spanish speaking population and they have concerns about how they're perceived locally, working with groups that specifically do a lot of work with those communities can make the hub much more successful, and also mean critically that people are much more likely to use it when they actually need it.
And a quick follow-up to this that we just received, someone asked, how early in the planning process should communities be involved?
From our revised standpoint, we were saying from the very beginning, like talk to them as this idea is percolating, where to put it, who will be served, what will the point of the hub be. From the very beginning, it's really important to make sure people in the community are aware that this is an idea, because this will impact how people make decisions. And it's really important to make sure that they feel safe being a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of every project, you always do a review and there's always the same response. We should have talked to more people earlier, but that's not feasible. You can't talk to everybody at the beginning. So I think for us, it was key that we talked to community leaders first and have them sort of help us drive the boat for a couple of reasons. One is it creates a certain amount of political backing that, if we have the community behind us, it's harder for the politicians to get involved. But two is that once we get the community behind us, then we can bring in infrastructure, we can bring in emergency management, we can bring in other people based on what we're talking about at that time. But having that core sort of foundation of the community members being part of that conversation is so critical to this, because if you do this later, if you have them involved later, then they may assume you've already made all these decisions before them. So providing that transparency and starting with a core of like 10 to 20 community members that are very active in the community is what I would recommend.
We went slightly different. We started working with our existing community institutions as opposed to members of the public. Like we went to Peace and to Community Action Network, the leadership there, and we said, you're providing really critical services. What are your pain points, right? And they're so deeply connected with the community, and then it's working with them. They're the face of the work, and it's really centering their needs. So I agree, but I don't think it's realistic to pretend you're going to talk to everyone, and that, I'll be candid, I don't even think that's going to lead to a good hub in most cases. So I would caution that you're going to need different things in different places. For us, we have some existing trusted community stakeholders. That's who we leaned and who we are leaning into, and then they're guiding what the rest of the engagement process should look like.
So we have a question coming in from someone who is interested in implementing this idea in a rural community. And so they say, it appears that existing or in progress hubs are in urban areas. Do the panelists have any thoughts about implementation in rural areas?
Yeah, when we started this work, there was a lot of discussions about rural communities. So in Austin, we have this suburbanization of poverty intersecting with rural poor. And when community members were like, hey, we got to talk about the people who are most marginalized, is people in rural communities. So we brought in Travis County, which has a bigger footprint than Austin, and started to really focus on like, how can we, identify one or two of these hubs in a more rural community. It is a lot harder because access in rural communities is a lot harder. There's less roads, there's less infrastructure, there's less community facilities. But that's when you're like, it will only work if we continue to push farther out and try to work with local transportation agencies, local churches, and sort of build that network in the rural communities, because by far they are the most sensitive to any kind of shock or stressor.
Yeah, we just submitted a grant application to work throughout the county where we expand the resilience hubs infrastructure to ensure that we're meeting certainly urban and rural and suburban kind of needs, and acknowledging that those may look different. And I'm going to take this as a jumping point to say one thing I'm really concerned about if I look ahead is how all of these hubs connect. Right. So it's one thing to have these disparate hubs that are serving a region, but what is the fabric between them that we're building? And I don't know the answer. And so that's part of the grant that we applied for, was to try to figure out, so what, like, so how are we connecting every single day, blue sky days and those, dangerous days, to make sure that the residents' needs are met.
So the next question that we have that came in asked about, do you all have any tips on demonstrating the cost benefit of solar and energy efficiency projects with a reluctant but very trusted and well-placed partner? So the specific example is that they have a few very interested Catholic churches that would be great as resilience hubs, but there's kind of the larger authority, the archdiocese, that owns the facilities and is reluctant about the solar installation itself.
While Missy, was hesitant to say that they're taxing each other for carbon, I'm reluctant to say that we own our own energy company in Austin, and we're having a battle right now of who can provide the redundant power, because we have one group is like, we'll buy you 70 diesel generators. We're like, and then we have like Texas Gas saying, we'll help you with natural gas generators. Meanwhile, we have Austin Energy, we'll help you with solar and battery backup. And it's like, I don't know, it's a little bit of a mess, but the issue there is, there's a lot of examples of solar and battery backup on residential, but there are actually very few examples of solar battery backup on commercial properties. They're a little bit different and a little bit more complex, especially when you get into that your system is not going to fully power your location during an event. Then you have to make hard decisions of what stays on and what goes off. And so all that to say, do it. If you can just solar and battery backup, just do it. I mean, it is by far the best option. It's more expensive up front, but it's actually much cheaper long run. We did an analysis of diesel generators versus solar. Diesel generators are much cheaper up front. You have to run the generators once a week for 30 minutes every week for the whole year, and that costs a lot in maintenance, costs a lot in gas. So solar battery backup is definitely the best from our perspective.
I'd also offer, it depends on where you are in the marketplace, but a battery can serve purposes in blue sky days too, right? So that generation that you have in the solar, you can actually store it and then you can use it at night. And so you're getting more use than just a generator that you're turning on in an emergency. So there's additional value there. If you're talking about a house of worship, then you're talking about stewardship and the value that sort of plays, which is hard to quantify, but yet very much tied, right, to many of our religion and religious institutions that exist. And there are creative ways, if someone is reluctant to move something forward, depends on your state, right? States are the original sovereign, so I'm not going to pretend to know where this person is, but we worked locally on a PPA, a power purchase agreement model for houses of worship, where the tenants or the individuals who are attending that house of worship actually are the owners of the PPA. So they make investments and then the house of worship gets all the benefit. So it's a different ownership model, which allows you to kind of like proof of concept it. So that's something that exists, but in many places you don't need them. We just needed them here. Michigan's very tricky in terms of how you navigate the energy landscape. So don't make it that convoluted if you don't need to, I guess is the story.
RMI has several tools and experts that can help provide cost estimations for what a solar and storage system would look like. And there's other drawbacks to including things such as like diesel generators. So for one thing, they're very noisy. Like Mark said, you have a lot of maintenance costs and they can be quite expensive as well. But they can also contribute a lot to poor air quality because they are combusting fuel. And when people are already dealing with a disaster, their immune systems are probably being weakened because of stress. There's that trade-off to consider as well in terms of like, what are you then exposing people to in the location where they're going to be safe? And like Missy said, batteries do have a multitude of benefits. You can use them at other points during the day. One other thing that RMI produced as a result of the cohort that we worked on with the Texas cities is we have a free template, a free RFP template online for people to use for procuring a solar and storage system. So I can provide a link to that in the chat as well, just to kind of help people start thinking through what would the technical requirements of such a system actually look like for their building.
So this next question kind of deals with, I guess, the intersection of resilience hubs and the unhoused population. So this person asked, I'm wondering about what conversations have been had for these resilience hubs / community hubs and the resources they are receiving in contrast with those for homeless shelters and similar. So they added, I don't tend to hear the homeless population being considered during conversations about resilience hubs. So I don't know if you all have anything to discuss on that.
Yeah, I want to name this. So one, I want to bifurcate the difference between emergency shelters and resilience hubs one more time. This came to bear for us in the February ice storm, where we were standing up, our resilience hubs existed, and we were also putting overnight sheltering in place because so many people had lost power that we needed more infrastructure. And this was a question that we sort of struggled with, like, what are we going to do for our unhoused and underhoused residents? And so we ended up doing more traditional emergency management work. We stood up additional facilities, but what we found is that one of our shelters lost power. And so they were down. And so the first thing we had to do was make sure they had power or a place to send folk. So I didn't mention this, and I should have. We are now like another kind of conversation in that resilience, I'm going to say air quote resilience hub space, because it's providing critical services for our underhoused residents, but those look different. It's the same ethos. It's designed by the residents and their need, but they are looking different than kind of what it's looking like in a neighborhood center. But we are working with our underhoused agency and their overnight sheltering facilities, food facilities, to create a resilience hub that's really focused on our underhoused population.
Yeah, it's a big topic. Our underhoused population is burgeoning. It's growing really fast, and we're having a hard time sort of keeping up. Two things. One is some of our hubs are closer to downtown or closer to creeks, so they have an increase in people who are experiencing homelessness who will go to the rec centers and ask for help. And we need to sort of be thinking about that, as Missy said, in our emergency management. But the other thing is that like our rec center staff are some of the like most wholesome people I've met. They have informal structures. They actually collect food and hand food in bags to people when they ask for it, or they collect socks and hand them out informally. They don't want anybody to know, because if people knew like, oh, this place has free food, everybody will come. But like there's starting to be this relationship between the same people who live near the rec centers and the people who work there to sort of connect and see how we can help each other. So we're trying to like rethink the whole homelessness conversation to like, rather than it be like them over there living without homes, rec centers here, resilience hubs, like how can we start to bridge that? And that's why you'll see in that the list of community groups, we're starting to include a lot more community groups working with homeless population to ensure that we're thinking about those, because if we don't, there's gonna be a lot more tension between communities and people experiencing homelessness.
Okay, so I want to wrap up with just one final question here. So I'm interested to know kind of what are the biggest challenges at this point that you see that you faced in either the planning or implementation of resilience hubs, and how have you overcome these challenges, or how are you thinking about overcoming these challenges?
For us, the biggest challenge is setting expectations, because people are like, oh, great, resilience hubs, they'll be done next week, right? When's the grand opening? Like, and it's going to do everything. It's going to provide food and cure cancer, right? And there's this like perception that people have of what resilience hubs are. And at the same time, like, they're not going to be everything for everyone. They have to be something for the people who live there. And setting that expectation is really hard, especially when you have, politicians, you have staff, you have community groups all wanting different things. So, and we still struggle with that. Like, how do you make clear exactly what these locations are going to do, especially during an event? A lot of these rec centers can't be overnight shelters. Libraries can't be overnight shelters. Doesn't mean that libraries can't be resilience hubs. So I think that is the biggest challenge, and I'm not 100% sure I know exactly how to get over it.
Three things pop into my head. One is where to draw the line. Mark opened this up with libraries, right? Like, libraries are deeply, deeply trusted. That is where people go for us, but that's not proving for us to be an appropriate location in the community. So how deep and how far do you go? Like, when is enough enough? And I don't know the answer. The second is capacity. We don't have enough people, we don't have enough time, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough of all of it. And then the third is one we haven't named here, but everyone wants one, and that includes some of my more affluent neighborhoods who have a lot of power and access to political voice. And I have to say, not yet, not you, right? And that's not easy to hold that back.
In our experience from working on these things, like Mark said, it can be level setting with expectations, but a lot of our focus is very technical. So one of the big things that we sought to provide to cities was technical resources and guidance, and that can be very challenging because resilience hubs can be so many things, and it's very hard to write templates or materials that can help people across the country, because the things that people in Arizona need to prepare for example, are very different than what somebody in Maryland or Hawaii might care about. So from our perspective, just making sure people know what are they actually trying to prepare for, and then giving them the resources to adequately get that from outside contractors, especially for these energy efficiency and the renewable energy systems, because this can be quite complicated topics to be engaging with.
All right, I think we're going to wrap it up there. We still have so many questions that are coming in, so I truly think we could continue this conversation for a very long time. I'm going to try to go ahead and screen share this slide one last time, but I want to thank our panelists for an absolutely excellent session. This was really informative, and I appreciate you all taking the time to share your experiences and your expertise with us. For the rest of our attendees, I just wanted to remind you all one last time that we have one final session that will be held 2 weeks from today that will focus on extreme heat. And I also wanted to let you know that we will have a survey that goes out after that final session on May 17th. And I encourage you to take that survey, let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. We are always looking to improve. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up. Thank you everyone for attending today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye everyone.